Welcome back to my Next.js course. In this video, I'll talk about server actions. Server actions are not specific to Next.js. They are a React implementation which is also integrated in the Next.js framework. Server actions allow us to run server-side code directly after a form submission. Server actions are subroutines executed on the server meant to be executed as a result of a form action. Let's jump into the demo to get an idea with practical examples. Okay, to start, let's create a new Next.js project. I'll use create next app with npx, of course, always the latest. And I'll call my project Next.js server actions. I don't want to use TypeScript. I will use ESLint and I won't use Tailwind. I want a source directory and the app router. I'll come back after the project bootstraps. All right, now that the project is bootstrapped, I'll cd into it and open it with VS Code. Let's close the terminal. Okay, let's see what we have. I'll run it with npm run dev. You probably know what to expect. We will have a Next.js starter application. So let's clean it up a bit. I'll remove some of the files, the readme, the styles. I don't need any of the styles. In the layout, I'll remove the global CSS import and the interfont. Don't need that. I'll leave the metadata as it is. It's not important for this demo. And here I'll remove the interclass name from the body. In layout, we have HTML and the body tag. Save that. In page, I'll remove the imports for image and styles and only leave the main tag. Remove the class name from it and I wanted to just have the home string in the main tag. In public, we have some images, which I don't need. And now we have a pretty clean Next.js project. If I refresh to invalidate some cached styles, I just have home in a main tag. And that's my home page, which is great. So now let's execute a server action. What is the simplest way to execute a server action? In React server-side components, we can do it inline. I can just write a function here. I'll call it walk because I want my action at this point to just walk something to the console on the server. And actions need to be async functions. So far, this is just a function. To make it a server action, I have to specify the use server directive on line 1 in the subroutine. And this action will just console walk something to the console. All right. Now, to invoke this action, this is a valid action, I need a form. And the simplest form I can write will just have a single submit button. All right, this is the form. Now, I want when I submit this form to invoke this action. To do so, I'll use the action attribute and pass the action to it. If I save, we have some error warnings here in the console. So I'll restart the app. These warnings are from while I was writing the action. Some intermediate saves happened. Now we don't have any warnings. And if I submit the form, I get my walk server action executing and it is console logging. This statement is executing on the server. So I get the output in my terminal right here where the Next.js server is running. Now, so far we're running a server action with a form in a React server component, but the actions can be run in client components. Not like this though. If I specify this as a client component and refresh, I'll get an error specifying that I'm not allowed to define inline server actions in client components. But if I take this function from inline and paste it to a different file, which is executing on the server, I can use it in client components as well. And that's what I'll do. I'll call my file actions.js and the use server directive has to be on top. And I can export my log action from this file and import it back from actions. Now my application will work just like it did before, except that this is a client component. Notice a few details. When server actions are in a separate file like this, you can have multiple actions in one file, and this file can export all of them, and you can use them wherever you like. Also, when the actions are defined in a separate file, they can be used in both client and server components. while if they're inline, you can only use actions with server components. All right, so this code is basically just console logging something, one statement. It's running on the server. These server-side actions can execute any server-side code, Node.js code. You can basically connect with a database, do file system manipulation, anything. Powerful stuff. So right now, I'll show you how to do some database operations. To do so, I've decided to do demonstrations with SQLite. So I'll use the SQLite npm package, just a server-side node module. To use it, you need to install a few node packages, just the SQLite 3 database driver and the SQLite client. Once these are installed, you can use them. I'll create a db.js file. You can import the driver, as it says here in the usage section of the README, and the open function from the SQLite API. And this is the basic usage to open a DB connection. I won't use it like this exactly. I'll show you how I'll use it. I will define this DB variable as no, and I will export a getDB function, async function, that will check if DB is null, and in that case, it will set DB to a new database connection. And here in the database connection, we just need to specify a path to the database file. I want my database to be in the DB folder and call it todos.db. On first run, this connection, this client will create an empty SQLite database for me. I just need to create the DB folder in the project root. And I need to specify the driver, which is SQLite 3 database. All right. And this function, notice, if database is null, it opens a new database connection and it always returns the DB object. So in the application lifecycle, the first time I call this, it will create a new connection, and in all the other cases, it will just return that object, which is just one way to implement a singleton instance and one way to implement a DB connector in your project. There are many ways to do that. So let's import this getDB function. Here it is, with single quotes. It's what I prefer. And now in my work function, I can use the database, basically. The first thing I'll do is just get the DB object, and I will rerun the action to make sure that a database gets created. That's step one. Let's rerun the action, and the database is now connected. I don't get any console logs because the only statement right now is to get a DB connection. Now, let's open this database with just a database client. You can also do this with code. It's not that critical how you do it. I just think a client would be easier to show in the video. This is just a standard SQLite database that is empty right now. If I connect to it, it has no tables. Let's create a table. I'll create a table called todos, which will have a title field of type text. And I'll use that field as an ID and everything. It will just have a title. Let's run this query. Here's my new table, and its structure is a title field. All right, that's what I want for now. So the next step is to create items. So I'll rename this walk action to create, and it will insert items to the database. But I haven't shown you how to actually pass data from the form to the server-side action. So I'll remove this DB statement first and demonstrate how to pass form data to the action. Let's take the new action name here. To do so, let's first have a form field of type text for the title. So it should have a name title, and I'll make it required also, and add a placeholder to it. If I save now, create is not exported. Let me see. I haven't saved. All right. So I have my title field. And the good thing is, let me close these. The good thing is I don't need to do much to pass data. As this is a form action, all of the form data is passed by default. It's just the first argument. So here I have form data. And if I console log it, it's just a standard form data object. So I can output the title using form data get and the name of the field, which in that case is title. All right. So let's test that. Test title and submit. Title, test title. So now we're passing data from our form to the server action. Now the next step is to take this title, use the DB object to create a new to-do item in my database. And to do that, I will first get the DB object and I will execute db run. And here we have a couple of parameters. We will first write a query, which will be insert into to-dos, title, values will be a question mark, and then we'll pass the value, which will be from data get title. So this is the query I want to pass to I want to actually run. Let's do it in separate lines so that it's visible in my editor. And now if I run my server-side action, I'll just submit. Nothing happens. This is because I don't see my to-do items anywhere in my application. But if I open my SQL client and go inside of the database, I can see the content. And let me see, we don't have certain to-dos, title. Let me see. Okay, so I don't actually have any syntax error. I just need to do a query to select the to-dos as the content tab is not refreshing well. And the item is actually in the database. Now, let's actually output the items in our application so that we can see them as we create them. To do so, I will create another function inside this actions file. It wouldn't technically be an action, but it will still run on the server. I'll call it get all. It will be an async function, which will just, again, use the DB. And it will just retrieve the items by using the DB all option. And the query will be select everything from to-dos. That function will just return all rows from the database. And I can import it here in my page. In fact, my page doesn't need to be a client-side component for now. I can import this get all action and use it here. I'll retrieve to-dos with the get all action. I'll make my component an async function. And here I'll output them in an unordered list. I'll just map through all of them and output the title. The key will be the title. This is the unique identifier for these items, so we use that. All right, so we have it. Our test title is outputted in the unordered list. Notice that if I create a second one, it won't show up until I refresh. Now, this is because the request is cached and we can revalidate the cache for a specific route or a specific fetch request using a Next.js utility called revalidatePath or revalidateTag. Tag is used if you tag the fetch request with a specific tag, and path will just revalidate the specific path. In this case, I'll use path because my request is actually the home page in the home page, and I need to revalidate its path specifically. So I'll use revalidatePath from Next.js. And we can use this function in my action, asynchronous action. After I insert the new item in the database, I will revalidate the homepage. If I refresh now, I can create test title 3 and it will show up immediately, which is great. Now we have a one-way data flow so far. We are able to create server-side actions which execute code on the server and interact with the database. But the data flow happens from the form to the action, and then something happens in the database. Yes, this function is updating in real time because it's retrieving just the items from the database and we're invalidating the cache. But the actual create server action is not returning any messages to the form. You would usually want that to pass error messages, validation messages, or success messages also, or any other kind of data back from the action to the actual form component. To do that, we need to do a couple of things. First of all, we need to take this form and make it a separate component. This is because it needs to be a client component. I will call it create form. I'll explain in a second why we're moving it as a separate component. All right. And this create form component will be exported by default. I need to move a few export imports. This create action is needed in this form now. Great. Let's change the quotes to single. And this will be a client-side component, as I mentioned. All right. Now I can import it here, create form, and use it again in its old place. Okay, create is not defined. Let me see. I need to save. All right. So now this will function the same way it did before. Test title 4, submit, it will create a new item, no errors. I needed to move it because this form needs to become a client-side component in order to use the useFormState hook from React DOM. And I need that hook in order to use form state, which can be modified by the server action. This way I can pass messages back from the action to the form. And I can't make the whole page client-side component because I have server-side actions happening here as well. I am retrieving to-dos and outputting them here, which is a server action. Okay, now the useFormState hook, how do we use it? Much like the useState hook, it accepts an action, which is the first argument, and an initial state object. In this case, the state can be anything. In this case, I'll define it here, and it will just contain a message, which will be no by default. And what it returns is first the state and the form action. This form action is what my form needs to call now. So as the action is this form action provided from the hook and the hook accepts the real create action, the data flow is happening through this hook. And this way, the action can actually modify the state and I can access this state right here to output a message. Beneath the button, I will just output message in state if it's defined. Let me see, I have an error somewhere. Initial state is not defined. I have a typo probably. Yes, I do. All right. Okay. Now the difference that we have from the previous setup is that if I go to my action, here I get form data as the first argument. Now I get the old state as the first argument and the form data as the second. This is great because this is this state here. So you get the old state, the data from the form, and you can return whatever you return will be the new state. So you get unidirectional data flow, but the form has access to the updated state. So now I can do a couple of things. I can, for example, handle errors here. So I'll wrap my DB call in a try catch block. And if I have an error, I will return the new state, which will be message. And that message will be the error message from the form. I'll actually make this a one-liner. And if everything goes correctly, after I revalidate the cache, I will return another message, which will be item created successfully. Now, if I go back to my form, if I submit it again, let me refresh just in case, test title 5, submit, I get back my message, so the state gets updated and the item gets created. And I can use this to actually retrieve, to mutate the form state and display it to the client, which is great. So far, We also specified error handling. So let's make a syntax error here in the query to simulate a database error, let's say. And if I submit again, I get my SQLite error as an error message. Lastly, let's create a delete action just to see how to remove these items, because so far we can just add more items. I'll just fix my syntax error to make sure everything is working. All right. So let's work on the new feature now. I'll start, of course, with a remove action. I'll just export another server-side action from this actions document, which will be remove. Delete is a reserved word in JavaScript and in most languages, in fact. This remove action will expect a title because that's the unique identifier of my items. Don't do that in production, that's not good practice. Always have a unique identifier, some kind of ID field. And what this will do is use the database and it will just execute db run delete from query. The table is todos where title is equal to, and I have the title as an argument. So see, so far we've only passed form data. We'll see how to pass a custom parameter to this server action here. And that's basically what this action will do. And this action will be executed by each item. So my items so far are just an unordered list of to-dos. I'll modify that a bit. I'll make this a div and expand this to multiple lines actually. All right. So I will no longer have a list item. I will have a parent div. And here we'll have the to-do title as one element and the delete button. Not a button, but of course we need to have a whole form with a button of type submit, which will delete an item. And this form action will be the new action we created called remove. As I mentioned, I don't want to pass the form data here. I want to pass a custom argument. So I can just bind this argument, which will be to do title in this case. This will create a new action with the provided this element and parameters. And you can do that with server-side actions. Don't worry at all. You can bind functions to create new ones. It's not a problem. So now I have my items and I can press delete. If I refresh, the item will disappear. I need to refresh because I need to revalidate path after I delete the item. Now, if I execute that again, I can remove items as I wish. I get the message back and everything is working as expected. So this is how you work with server-side actions in Next.js. With this, I'll wrap today's video. If you like the content, don't forget to subscribe to get notified when I release another video. Take care.